Ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully. I want you to understand something that most investors will not recognize until the consequences are already visible in markets, portfolios, and purchasing power. Not because the information is unavailable, not because the evidence is hidden, but because accepting what is happening requires abandoning assumptions that have guided investors for decades. Most people still believe the system is fundamentally stable. They believe the next challenge is simply another interest rate decision, another earnings season, another election cycle, or another temporary period of volatility. They assume that what worked during the last 20 years will continue working during the next 20 years. I do not believe that is the reality we are facing. What I see developing is far larger than a normal market cycle. I am not talking about a minor correction. I'm not talking about a routine recession. I'm talking about the gradual emergence of forces that have historically appeared near the end of major monetary eras and the late stages of long-term debt expansions. You need to understand what is happening. The global financial system has been supported for years by conditions that cannot continue indefinitely. Low interest rates encourage borrowing, borrowing supported spending, spending supported growth, rising asset prices reinforced confidence, confidence encouraged even more borrowing. For a long time, the cycle appeared self-sustaining. Investors became comfortable, governments became dependent, corporations adapted their strategies around it. Financial markets began treating extraordinary conditions as if they were permanent. History snorts has never been kind to that assumption. When I study financial history, I repeatedly encounter the same pattern. Debt expands faster than productive growth. Asset values rise faster than underlying economic fundamentals. Policymakers intervene to smooth volatility, confidence increases, risk-taking accelerate. Then eventually the gap between reality and expectations becomes impossible to ignore. This never ends quietly. The specific details change from one era to another, but the underlying mechanics remain remarkably consistent. Human behavior does not change, incentives do not change, excessive leverage does not change. The outcome may take different forms, but the pressures always emerge. Today, debt levels across major economies remain extraordinarily high. Governments continue running large deficits. Pension obligations are growing. Healthcare costs continue climbing. Demographic trends are reducing the growth rate of many developed economies. These are not short-term problems. These are structural realities. And structural realities eventually overpower political narratives. The challenge becomes even more significant when you recognize how dependent the modern system has become on credit creation. Economic growth increasingly relies on new borrowing. Financial markets increasingly rely on liquidity. Asset prices increasingly depend on favorable monetary conditions. The problem is that every debt-based system eventually reaches a point where additional borrowing produces diminishing benefits. More debt creates less growth. More stimulus creates less productivity. More intervention creates greater dependency. At first, these effects are subtle, then they become obvious. This is why I believe we're approaching a period that many investors are not prepared for. Central banks face an impossible balancing act. If snorts they maintain restrictive policies for too long, economic weakness intensifies. If they provide excessive liquidity, inflationary pressures return. If they allow rates to rise significantly, debt service burdens become increasingly difficult to manage. If they suppress rates, currency purchasing power gradually erodes. There are no painless solutions, only different forms of adjustment. And throughout history, heavily indebted systems have tended to choose the path that distributes pain gradually rather than concentrating it immediately. That path often involves monetary expansion. It often involves financial repression. It often involves declining purchasing power over time. Most investors underestimate how important this is. They focus on nominal returns, they focus on account balances, they focus on market indexes, but wealth preservation is not about the number displayed on a statement. Real wealth is measured by purchasing power. Real wealth is measured by what your capital can actually acquire in the future. That distinction becomes critical during periods of monetary transition because when confidence in traditional stores of value begins to weaken, capital does not remain idle. Capital moves quickly at first, then rapidly. Investors begin searching for assets that cannot be created through policy decisions. They begin looking for scarcity, they begin looking for credibility, they begin looking for stores of value that exist outside the direct influence of expanding balance sheets and increasing debt burdens. This is where the conversation becomes extremely important for silver holders because silver occupies a position that very few assets can claim. It's simultaneously an industrial necessity and a monetary asset. It participates in economic growth. it participates in wealth preservation, and when those two functions begin reinforcing one another, the implications can become significant. Most people are still looking at silver through an outdated lens. They see a commodity, they see price fluctuations, they see volatility. What they fail to see is the larger framework forming around it. The real story is not silver alone. The real story is the convergence of debt, monetary policy, risk, industrial transformation, and changing investor behavior. When those forces begin moving together, markets can reprice much faster than conventional analysis suggests. The next phase of this story is where things become even more consequential, because the forces building beneath the surface are no longer theoretical. They are already in motion. Now, I want you to focus on something that most market participants rarely examine. They spend enormous amounts of time studying individual assets while ignoring the system that ultimately determines how those assets are valued. That is a mistake. Markets do not operate in isolation. Stocks do not exist independently from interest rates. Bonds do not exist independently from debt burdens. Currencies do not exist independently from monetary policy. And silver certainly does not exist independently from the structural forces reshaping the global economy. The reason this matters is because major repricing events rarely begin with the asset itself. They begin with the environment surrounding the asset. By the time the majority notices the movement, the foundations were often shifting years earlier. That is exactly why I believe silver deserves far more attention than it is currently receiving. Look at what is happening across the world. Governments continue accumulating obligations at a pace that would have seemed extraordinary a generation ago. Fiscal deficits that were once considered temporary have become normal. Emergency measures have evolved into permanent policy frameworks. Debt levels continue expanding, while productivity growth struggles to keep pace. This creates a challenge that policymakers cannot easily solve. Growth alone is unlikely to eliminate the burden. Tax increases carry political consequences. Austerity creates social tension. Default remains unacceptable for major economies. That leaves a narrow set of options, and history provides a fairly consistent guide regarding which options governments tend to favor when debt burdens become too large. Financial systems frequently move toward policies that gradually reduce the real value of those obligations over time. Not necessarily through dramatic events, not necessarily through sudden collapse, but through a long process of monetary dilution and purchasing power erosion. Many people misunderstand how this works. They expect a crisis to arrive with obvious warning signs. They expect dramatic headlines. They expect instant disruption. That is rarely the pattern. Most monetary transitions begin quietly. Confidence fades slowly. Behavior changes incrementally. Allocations shift beneath the surface. Then eventually the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. This is why awareness matters. The investors who recognize structural changes early are often able to position themselves before the broader market fully understands what is happening. The investors who wait for confirmation frequently discover that confirmation arrives after much of the move has already occurred. History has demonstrated this repeatedly. The crowd rarely moves first. The crowd reacts. Institutional capital tends to move earlier. Strategic capital tends to move earlier, informed capital tends to move earlier, and when momentum develops, participation expands rapidly. Now consider silver within this context. Unlike many financial assets, silver benefits from two separate demand channels that can reinforce one another during periods of transition. The first is industrial demand, the second is monetary demand. Most discussions focus on only one side of that equation. I believe that is a serious oversight. On the industrial side, silver remains deeply integrated into technologies that are becoming increasingly important to the global economy. Electrification requires conductive materials. Advanced electronics require conductive materials. Energy infrastructure requires conductive materials. Digital systems require conductive materials. Silver possesses physical characteristics that make substitution difficult in many applications. That matters because industrial demand is not primarily driven by investor sentiment. It is driven by necessity. Manufacturers do not purchase silver because they are optimistic. They purchase it because production requires it. That distinction becomes important when evaluating long-term trends. At the same time, monetary demand operates according to an entirely different set of incentives. Investors become interested in silver when concerns emerge regarding inflation, currency stability, debt, sustainability, and real purchasing power. Those motivations are not connected to manufacturing activity. They are connected to financial preservation. Now, imagine both forces strengthening simultaneously. Industrial consumption continues expanding. Investor interest begins increasing, supply growth remains constrained, the balance becomes increasingly sensitive. This is where many people underestimate silver. They assume that because prices have experienced periods of volatility in the past, future moves will remain contained. But markets do not operate according to assumptions. They operate according to supply, demand, perception, and capital flows. When perception changes, valuation frameworks change. When valuation frameworks change, price behavior changes. And when scarcity meets accelerating demand, movements that once appeared improbable can suddenly become entirely rational. The key word here is perception, because perception often changes before statistics fully reflect reality. Investors begin asking different questions. Instead of asking how much return an asset might generate, they begin asking how effectively it preserves value. Instead of pursuing maximum growth, they begin pursuing durability. Instead of focusing on speculation, they begin focusing on resilience. That shift can be profound, and once it begins, it tends to spread. People observe institutional behavior, they observe allocation changes, they observe macroeconomic developments. Gradually, the narrative evolves. Then momentum emerges. This is why I continue emphasizing the distinction between cyclical events and structural events. Cyclical events come and go. Structural events redefine expectations. A recession is cyclical, an earnings slowdown is cyclical. A monetary transition is structural, a debt regime adjustment is structural, a widespread reassessment of purchasing power is structural. Those developments influence asset allocation decisions for years rather than months, and I believe many investors are still treating today's environment as though it is merely another cycle. I do not see it that way. What I eye is an increasingly fragile balance between debt expansion, monetary intervention, fiscal pressure, and economic reality. That balance can remain stable longer than many expect, but stability should never be confused with permanence. History has proven that repeatedly, the larger the imbalance becomes, the greater the eventual adjustment tends to be. And when that adjustment begins, the market rarely sends invitations in advance. It simply moves. That is why understanding the forces beneath the surface is far more important than reacting to headlines after the fact. Because once awareness spreads broadly, the opportunity snorts to position early often disappears. And what happens next may be the most important part of this entire discussion, because the relationship between monetary stress, investor psychology, and silver demand becomes even more powerful when confidence itself starts to shift. Listen carefully, because this is where the situation becomes personal. Up to this point, we've discussed debt, monetary policy, capital flows, and industrial demand. Those are important. They provide the framework. They explain why the environment is changing, but frameworks alone do not determine outcomes. Investor behavior determines outcomes. And throughout history, the most significant market moves have occurred when collective psychology suddenly catches up to structural reality. That is the phase many people fail to anticipate. Most investors assume major repricing events begin with widespread awareness. They do not. They begin with limited awareness. A small number of participants recognize a developing imbalance. They study the data, they observe the trends, they notice the disconnect between perception and reality, then they act. Only later does the broader market respond. This pattern is repeated across countless financial cycles. The majority rarely leads, the majority follows. That is why timing matters. Not because anyone can predict exact dates, not because anyone possesses perfect foresight, but because understanding structural forces allows investors to recognize probabilities before they become obvious. The real question is not whether uncertainty exists. Uncertainty always exists. The real question is whether the direction of the underlying forces is becoming clearer, and I believe it is. Consider what investors are confronting today. Debt burdens remain elevated. Fiscal deficits remain persistent. Currency purchasing power continues facing pressure. Real yields remain vulnerable. Economic growth remains uneven. Geopolitical competition continues intensifying. Supply chains continue evolving. Governments continue searching for ways to manage obligations that grow faster than revenues. None of these developments exist independently. They reinforce one another together. They create an environment where confidence becomes increasingly important, because confidence is the foundation upon which modern financial systems operate. Currencies function because people trust them. Debt markets function because investors trust a repayment. Financial assets function, investors trust valuation assumptions. When confidence is strong, the system appears stable. When confidence weakens, behavior changes, and behavior is what ultimately moves markets. This is why silver occupies such an interesting position. It benefits when industrial demand expands, but it can also benefit when confidence in traditional financial assets begins to erode. Very few assets possess that combination. Most investments depend heavily on a single source of demand. Silver operates within multiple demand frameworks simultaneously that creates a unique dynamic. And during periods of monetary uncertainty, unique dynamics often produce unexpected outcomes. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting that markets move in straight lines. They never do. Volatility is inevitable. Corrections are inevitable. Periods of disappointment are inevitable. Every major trend experiences setbacks. Every significant repricing unfolds through a series of advances and retracements. That is normal. What matters is the direction of the larger forces underneath the fluctuations. And those forces deserve serious attention because the environment supporting silver today looks very different from the environment that existed decades ago. Industrial demand is broader, technological dependence is greater, monetary pressures are more visible, debt burdens are larger, fiscal constraints are tighter. The combination is unusual, perhaps more unusual than many investors realize. This brings us to the possibility that gives this discussion its urgency. A possibility is not simply that silver rises. Silver has risen before. The possibility is that the market begins reassessing silver's role within a changing financial system. That is a very different event when markets reevaluate an asset's importance. Price targets that once seemed unrealistic can suddenly become topics of serious discussion, not because speculation has increased, but because the assumptions underlying valuation have changed. That distinction is critical. Most people focus on price. Sophisticated investors focus on drivers. Rates is the outcome. Drivers create the outcome, and the drivers affecting silver today are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Industrial transformation continues advancing, monetary challenges continue accumulating, debt pressures continue expanding, confidence questions continue emerging. At some point, markets begin connecting those dots. When they do, capital allocation decisions change. Portfolio strategies change, risk assessments change, and once those changes begin spreading across institutions, funds, family offices, and individual investors, momentum can build faster than many expect. History has shown this repeatedly. Major moves often appear impossible before they begin, then obvious while they are happening, then inevitable after they have occurred. That sequence repeats again and again. The investors who benefit most are usually not those with perfect predictions. They are the ones who correctly identify structural trends before the crowd fully recognizes them. That is why awareness remains the most valuable asset. Awareness allows preparation. Preparation allows discipline. Discipline allows rational decisions. When volatility arrives without awareness, investors become reactive. With awareness, investors become strategic, and strategy matters enormously during periods of transition because transitions create both risk and opportunity. Those who ignore structural shifts often discover that old assumptions no longer provide protection. Those who understand structural shifts position themselves accordingly. That does not eliminate uncertainty. Nothing can, but it improves the probability of preserving purchasing power and navigating change effectively. So let me leave you with this. Silver holders should not focus exclusively on daily price movements. They should focus on the larger forces shaping the future. Watch the debt cycle, watch monetary policy, watch fiscal conditions.